Hello my friends and welcome back to my painting channel. And in this video we are painting Leon Kennedy from the Resident Evil 2 board game. So if you've watched my other video of how I painted Ada 1, this is the second character and the second painting that I'm doing from the Resident Evil 2 board game. And these miniatures are brilliant fun to paint. They're a little bit small, tad smaller than the normal I believe. I think they are slightly smaller than the normal type of models that I would normally paint. But they're fantastic to paint either way, and they've got so much character as well. Now, as always, I'm starting by painting the skin, and on this one I'm starting with the bellow beige red. Now, I did think about painting this one a little bit brighter, and that's why the skin is a little bit brighter underneath to begin with, but don't worry, we're starting with the beige red instead. This is the beauty of painting in thin layers. It means that if you make a mistake, you can always go over one of those layers and you can touch it back up a little bit later, so it's not a problem. So once we've done the beige red first, we're then going to put on a small bit of the Army Painter Flesh Wash. This is one of my favourite washes, especially across the skin and things like gold. This tones down lovely and allows you to build back up brilliantly. If you are not a fan of the Army Painter, you can always use the Citadel, and the Reichland Flesh Shade is exactly the same kind of colour and tone as well. So once we've done that, and once the wash has dried, we're going to move back onto that beige red and just rebuild the colour back up, but avoiding the recessed areas, so avoiding the patches and the areas where the wash has settled. Now for these miniatures, because of how small they actually are, I'm not actually going to be painting any of the eyes on the smaller miniatures. It's actually quite difficult just to paint the face on these ones. I'm just lucky that I've got a good set of magnifying glasses to be able to paint this small. So yeah, just take your time doing the face. Like I say, we're just going back with that beige red and just building that colour back up, avoiding where the wash has dried. Now what I'm doing from there is I'm building sort of a half and half blend. So I'm putting in a little bit of the basic skin tone, and I'm mixing that in with the beige red as well to create a highlight colour, as you can see here. And I'm just using a very thin sort of layer of paint then, just to paint this back in and try to leave a little bit more of that beige red underneath, and just leave where that beige red is joining in, like creating sort of like, as you can see, just around the nose, just creating a little bit of shade around the nose and things like that. So I'm trying to create a little bit of a highlight and a little bit of a highlight colour. Like I say, these models are particularly small, so a lot of this is very, very fine brushwork, so you've got to use the very, very tip of your brush and try to use thin coats, so you don't put too much paint onto the brush and don't put too much paint onto the miniature. They've got a good little bit of detail, but if you put too much paint onto the miniature, you're going to lose your details, and that's the last thing you want to do, is lose any of those details. So once we've done that stage, we're just going to go straight on to the next highlight, and the next highlight is going to be the basic skin tone on its own. And again, this is very, very thin, and what I'm going to try to do now is just focus this across more of the top area of the face. So as you can see, I'm focusing a lot more just across the cheekbones, across the forehead, the nose, and a little bit across the chin as well, trying to leave a little bit of the other colour across the side of the face. So this is mostly about the highlight layer, so we're not going to cover the whole thing. This is just about using thin layer just around those cheekbones and things like that, and again around the fingers and things through those fingerless gloves. Again, this is all work just with the very, very, very tip of the brush. I use a brush number 1 and a number 0. Those are my two go-to most common used brushes. For this painting, because of how small this model is, I'm using my size 0 brush actually to do all of the skin work and all of the face work and things like that. So if you do have a few different brushes there and you're wondering what size I'm using to paint, this is a size 0. So once we've finished doing all of the skin there, we're just going to move on and do all of the base colours. And with the base colours, I'm using a couple of my favourite colours, and if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll recognise a few of these colours. Starting with a dark rust colour. So this is a nice dark brown colour. This is a brilliant base colour for things like hair, leather straps and things like that. So we're just painting his hair with this colour because we're obviously going to lighten that up a little bit later on. But this is a really good base and a really good starting dark brown colour for the hair. Just want to be very, very careful around the front here so that we don't get any of that brown onto the face. After working so hard on getting the skin tones and things looking as good as they are, the last thing we want to do is to end up putting any of that brown across the forehead or the face. Now, for the clothing, I was torn with this one as to make him a little bit more retro like the original games, or a little bit more modern like the new games. And in the modern games, Leon seems to be wearing a lot darker clothing, whereas in the original games he's a lot lighter clothing. So what I'm trying to do is kind of incorporate a little bit of both, I guess. So we're going to try and use a dark Prussian blue as the base. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tone that right down and make that really dark, and then gradually tone that back up so that we've got a little bit of an in-between. So we've got a nice blue, but it's not overly bright and it's not too extreme, so that the colours are going to look just about right for the sort of the sort of uniform, the sort of police uniform that Leon's wearing. So just be careful and cover the miniature, cover all of the blue bits, so the top and the trousers in this. Just trying to avoid the armoured plating, so the vest that he's wearing, and there's a little bit of that just across his shoulders and of course across the front of him as well. But you can get and you can see a little bit of the blue just underneath on the inside here. So again, just try to be careful not to get any of the colour on the skin, and take your time just to get the paint just around that sort of chest area as much as you can. So once the blue is dry, I'm going to move on and just use a Stonewall grey. This is a nice middle of the road grey. This is not too light, not too dark, and we're just going to cover over the long sleeve shirt that he's wearing. As again, looking at all of the images and remembering from memory from when I used to play the game and things like that, Leon has a couple of different colours. So he's got the blue, police uniform, he's got the light grey long sleeves, and he's got a few sort of dark grey patches just around on the armour and the shoulder pads and the elbow pads and things like that. So for the dark grey, I'm using another one of my favourite colours, and this one is a German grey. I'm just going to go across the chest piece here, and of course then I'm going to paint the belt the same colour, his boots the same colour, and things like the elbow pads and things like that as well. Just trying to be as careful as possible. It doesn't matter too much at this stage because you can't sort of fix any mistakes at this stage because we haven't really sort of built anything up from here. But the one area to be very careful of with this model is on the gloves, because the gloves are fingerless gloves. The last thing you want to do is sort of try to paint the gloves and end up painting over the skin that we've spent a bit of time doing. But also be careful with the shoulder pads as well. So on the shoulders, his uniform is blue, but there's just these little patches just on the sides there where you can see a little bit of the armoured or padded vest type of thing, and his little police shields are just on either shoulder there as well. I'm painting the gun the same colour as well, the German grey, and we'll boost all of that up a little bit later, and I'll show you a nice quick and easy way of getting the gun to look a little bit worn and things like that. So just taking my time now, being very careful as possible to just paint around the symbol and the writing just across the back. The good thing with this model is all of these little bits are already raised up, but you just got to be careful not to overdo it with the paint. So again, just using the very tip of the brush, just to try to drag a little bit of the paint across onto the miniature. So I'm using the dead white for this, and dead white is another one of my favourite paints. This one is a perfect paint to mix with other paints because it's a really vibrant sort of off-white. It's got a perfect colour for things like this because it really does stand out. It's quite vibrant, it pops really nicely. Probably one of the harder bits to reach is just the RPD sign just here on the inside across the armoured plate on the front. So just be very careful. Again, try to use the tip of your brush, but it doesn't matter if you make too many mistakes here because it is easy to repair from this stage. And once we've done that bit, we're just going to use a little bit of silver. So I'm using a gunmetal. I'm just using, again, the very tip of the brush. So I'm just going to paint a little bit around the belt buckle. The rivets on the armour I'm also painting in the same colour, just to tie things in. And I paint these before I apply the wash, just because sometimes when you paint a little bit of the silver in, when you use the wash then, it actually ties that silver into the darker colour underneath, which is exactly what we want. We want to try and get those colours to tie together quite nicely. And as you can see, the colours are already starting to show, and he's starting to look a little bit like he's supposed to. So with those little police shields just on the shoulders, I'm just going to paint in Retributor armour. So this is a Citadel gold. This is one of my favourite gold colours. Citadel do such a fantastic gold colour in this. So I'm just going to paint these two shoulder pads in gold. And gold might seem a little bit too bright at first, but once we put the shade across and things like that, they tone down and they do look just about right. And once we've done the gold and everything's all tied in together, and that's all of the base colours done, so we're just going to go around and cover the miniature in Null Nile, which is a Citadel black wash. So you could use any black wash that you like, but different washes do have different consistencies. With the Null Nile, because this is quite watery, this moves quite well around the miniature. You can manipulate it quite well, and you can kind of avoid it from pooling in certain areas. So this is a really good wash to use, especially on a small miniature like this, because you can use a finer brush to use the wash, and just be a little careful about where you place that. So as you can see, I'm going across the gun and the hair and things, but I'm avoiding putting the wash on any of the skin because we don't want to dark that skin down. And there you go. Once the wash is dry, then we can move on and start focusing on rebuilding all of those colours. So we're going to go back to that dark Prussian blue, and we're going to start to rebuild the blue colour right at the beginning. So we're going to go straight for the blue first, because this is the majority of the miniature. We're really going to focus on getting that blue to pop, and once we've got our blue where we want it, then we're going to do the same sort of thing with the smaller areas around the model. So I'm just painting up the blue, and as you can see, I'm trying to paint along the lines where the creases are, just going along with the folds and creating those folds and creating that depth, but without actually sort of painting the colour all over the miniature. By doing that, then it's creating the depth, because the shade is going to dry in those recessed areas, allowing then us to focus on highlighting the folds and bits where the blue will show off the most, where the light is going to catch. And what you want to do is just not try to catch the whole of the miniature, but just those areas that you think need a little bit of highlighting, especially around the legs and things like that, where you can see the folds of the trousers, and around the back you can see the folds where he's holding his gun out and things like that. So it's just a case of rebuilding that colour. So you don't want to paint it all, but you want to kind of rebuild it in layers. So once the first stage is done, I'm also then going to use a highlight. Now for the highlight, with this dark Prussian blue, you don't want to highlight it too much. So what I'm doing is I'm using a very thin down paint, which I tend to do quite a lot anyway, because they do blend when you're highlighting, and they do dry quite well, so they blend together quite nicely. And what I've done is I'm using a little bit of that dead white that we've used on the symbol, and I've just put a small drop of that in with the dark Prussian blue. And the reason why I'm only using a small amount is because that dead white increases the vibrancy, and it can change the colour and change the tone of that dark Prussian blue. So you don't want to use too much. You don't want to like do half and half, because it'll make the blue stand out and become way too bright, and we don't want it to be way too bright. We just want it to be a light highlight. So I'm just adding a small amount. So for this, I'd say about a 70-30. You could probably add a little bit smaller, just a tiny little drop each time, and build up from there and see kind of to what level you want the highlight to be. And as you can see, I'm just following again, just catching the very tip of the folds and catching the very highlight of the folds, just on purpose to try to make sure I'm getting as many of those highlights and creases as I can. And as you can see on his top, as that's drying down, it's drying into a really nice sort of folded, highlighted sort of style. So you just want to follow around the miniature as much as you can, and just keep highlighting to the areas that you think that you would highlight the most. Just following around and building up, especially across sort of the fronts and the knees and bits like that. Like I say, just following those creases. Just like so. So following the creases as much as possible, and not going over all of that blue. The more that you practice this, the more you get used to it, the more sort of like creative you can become with it, and the more used to it you get. And the more used to it you get, sort of the more the simpler and easier you tend to do it then afterwards. So it's all about practice. The more you practice, the better you get. Same as everything. So we're going to go back and we're going to do the same thing with the Stonewall Grey. So as you can see, with these long sleeves, I'm just painting across, but I'm leaving a few little gaps as well in the brush strokes. And that's just to create an element of a few folds and a little bit more depth to the miniature. So you don't want to paint it back one flat colour and then leave it looking too flat and too dull. So you want to kind of just, don't worry, and allow yourself to to use those brush strokes to your advantage to create that depth and creativity in the folds. And again, using the very, very tip of your brush. And we're doing the same thing again. We're adding a little bit of this dead white in. Now, the good thing is, because we're using a grey and a lighter colour, for this we can add a little bit more of that dead white. We don't need to be so small or so precise with this. So instead, for this one, I'm doing about a half and half. So for this, it's about half of the grey and half of the white. And that's just to boost the vibrancy. And as you can see, just using the very tip of your brush to create those folds. Now you could dry brush the hair, and I say this quite a lot with hair. You can dry brush the hair if you want, but myself personally, I'd rather use a few brush strokes and kind of paint the hair in, because it gives you a little bit more control, but it also looks a little bit neater at the end as well. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the dark rust, that dark colour that we used originally, and I'm mixing about half and half with a leather brown. And that leather brown is a nice lighter colour, and what it's going to do is, this is just going to build a nice highlight to the hair. Now I'm doing this as a first highlight, and then we're going to move on and just use only the leather brown on its own. And we're going to pick out the very tips of the hair and the finest sort of highlights as possible, and this is going to give that depth in the hair then, and build that depth up for the hair as well. So as you can see, just using the very, very tip of your brush, just trying your best not to go across too many of the details at once. So we're just trying to use that very tip of the brush just to pull across a few strands, as you can see, just using the very, very, very fine tip, and just pulling across a few different strands like this. You don't have to be too neat. I mean, his hair's going to be messy and things like that anyway. It's not going to be exact or precise, so you don't have to be too neat. But just by building those little colours and those little strands and those little highlights, it's just going to build that depth and create more to look at in the model than just one flat dark tone, see? There we go, just like so. Just like so. See, you don't have to be too strict and too precise, as long as we build in those tones up, and as long as we leave in strands and things like that behind. Just like so. So we're going to move in now, and we're going to try and attack this grey a little bit, and we're going to try and highlight and build this grey up a little. But we don't want to build it up too much, because if we go too extreme, then it's going to lose that sort of dark grey colour, and we don't want it to go too bright. So what I'm doing is I'm using a heavy charcoal, which is quite a dark colour, being very careful around the belt and around the shoes as well, just to build up a little bit more of the colour and a little bit more of the depth and things like that as well. You can see I'm just going to do the same thing on all of the armour, so just down here across the middle, and again on the shoulders as well, and of course just across the elbow pads and the hands. The gloves, again, just to be very careful on doing the individual sort of like finger, doing the individual fingers, so that we leave the wash just in the creases on the fingers as well. And there we go. So what we're going to do is, like I say, I'm just adding a little bit of that dead white back in. Now dead white, because of the vibrancy, the danger is it could become a little bit too bright. So what I'm going to do is just use this at the moment, just use this to build that brightness up a little. And I'm going to try and follow the creases as much as possible, so that it shows a little bit more of the folds and a little bit more of the dynamic sort of pose to the miniature as well. So just follow in, and again using the very tip of the brush as well. You don't want to put too much paint on there, and you don't want to cover too much. It doesn't matter about using brush strokes and showing all of those little rips and creases and things like that, because that's kind of what you want, is to build that depth. You don't want it to be one flat colour, like I say. You want to kind of give it a little bit more to look at. Same across the fingers, as you can see, being very careful just to touch just where those individual fingers are. And again, just around the elbow guards and the shoulder pads and things like that. And again, just across the chest piece. Now through the chest piece you can see just how precise and specific I'm trying to be. I'm just dragging that paintbrush across in sort of like diagonal brush strokes. And it doesn't matter too much about showing those brush strokes, because again it's going to add to the scratches and the roughness to the miniature, because not everything is perfect in in sort of life, especially with something like a bit of armour and an armoured chest piece. You kind of want it to be a little bit rough. Now what I'm doing, because I built that up just a slight tad too bright for myself, what I'm doing is just to put those colours back, so just to build those colours back together and just to bind the lighter and the darker grey together. I'm just going once more across a little bit of the area with a null and oil wash, so just tying those colours together. But this I'm only doing across just the grey areas, just to tie those areas together a little bit more again. And then for our final stage, or one of our final stages, just going to go across where that white is again. We're just going to pop, going to use that dead white to get that emblem to pop again. So we're just going to go back across it, just so that we bring that vibrance back out after the wash has sort of dulled it down a little bit. So we're just going to get this, the symbols and the writing just to pop by using the very tip of the brush. This is the area where you've got to be the most precise and just take your time. Don't rush, because any mistakes here and then you can have to redo little bits. So just take your time and enjoy this stage. It's very rewarding when this comes out. When you sit down, you spend your time, you take your time, and then you look back and you go, oh yeah, the symbol looks really good, and it stands out and it pops on the miniature. And there we go, the final stage. So I'm just going back to that gunmetal, and I'm just using the very edge of my dry brush. And I'm just going to dry brush a little bit of silver just back across that weapon. Try to be very small with this. You don't need to be too extreme. You don't need to put too much silver onto the miniature. I'm just rubbing a little bit of the silver back off with my thumb there and knocked him off my stand. And there we go, that's Leon all done. Like I say, these are particularly small miniatures, but they do have quite a good little bit of detail, so when you spend a bit of time and you work on those, they do look fantastic. You could build the colour back up on those gold emblems, but I didn't see any need. He looked absolutely fine to me for gaming as he is. As always, my friends, thank you very much for tuning in once more and for watching my videos.